Welcome to Businesstalk, a global platform that brings together distinguished faculty members to share their remarkable scholarly insights. I'm Deepak, your host from India. What does it mean to write with joy? Not just clarity, but genuine pleasure. Few people have explored that question as deeply or as globally as Dr. Helen Sword. Listeners, we are truly honored to welcome the distinguished Dr. Helen Sword as our special guest on today's episode of Business Talk. Before we begin, it's my pleasure to introduce the incredible mind behind today's conversation. A poet, scholar, and internationally recognized expert in academic, professional, and creative writing. Dr. Helen has spent her career dismantling the myth that good writing must be a grade. Her books, articles, and digital tools have reached writers across disciplines and continents, helping them write more clearly, confidently, and with far greater creative satisfaction. Born and raised in Southern California, Dr. Helen earned her PhD in comparative literature from Princeton University and went on to become an Emeritus Professor of Humanities at the University of Auckland. Today, she channels that academic rigor into her private writing consultancy, Writespace Limited, where she offers workshops, masterclasses, and retreats for writers at all levels and genres. She is also the founder of the Writespace, a thriving virtual writing community spanning over 30 countries. Her published works includes Stylish Academic Writing, published by Harvard University Press in 2012, The Writer's Diet, University of Chicago Press in 2016, Air in Light and Time and Space, again by Harvard University Press in 2017, and her most recent book, Writing with Pleasure, published by Princeton University Press in 2023. She's equally well known for Zombie Noun, a TEDx video that has surpassed 1 million YouTube views and introduced a new generation of writers to the power of lean, lively prose. A fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand, Dr. Helen has been recognized with numerous research and teaching honors and has delivered her evidence-based writing workshops at over 100 universities, research institutes, and organizations on every continent, Antarctica being the one holdout for now. Today, we are joined by Dr. Helen Sword to discuss her book, Writing with Pleasure, an essential guide to cultivating joy in both her professional and personal writing. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Helen Sword to the conversation. Dr. Helen, we deeply appreciate your acceptance of our invitation. It's an honor and privilege to host you today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Professor, most writers are conditioned to see writing as a stressful obligation. What was the moment you realized that pleasure and productivity in writing weren't mutually excessive and exclusive?
Well, I think I always kind of felt that myself, and it was only over time that I came to realize how many um, academic writers and business writers, people who write for a living, how many of them actually really are terrified of writing or anxious about writing or hate writing. I've always found it challenging, but it's always been a great pleasure for me to put words together. And I was, I guess, surprised to find that not as many people felt that way. But the real turning point for me was when I did the research for my book, Air and Light and Time and Space, which has the subtitle, How Successful Academics Write. And for that book, I interviewed 100 successful academic writers with quite a broad view of what success means. And I collected questionnaire data from over 1,200 writers in something like 15 countries, mostly faculty, postdoctoral researchers, PhD students, so quite high level writers. And I asked them how they learn to write in their discipline. I asked them how they get their writing done, so the whole productivity thing. And I asked them, how do they feel about their writing? How do they feel about academic writing? That was my open-ended question. What are the main emotions that you feel when you think about your academic writing? And that was a big eye-opener because I realized, first of all, academics don't talk about their emotions around writing. It's like, no, we're not supposed to have emotions. But when people could talk about it and were asked, a lot of things came out. And in my book, in Air, and Light, and Time and Space, I have two word frequency diagrams. So one is from the questionnaire research, all these people who came to my workshops and answered this anonymous questionnaire. And I have the 40 most frequent emotion words. The biggest one by a long way is frustration, followed by anxiety. And most of the words you see out of those top 40 are quite negative: fear, dread, all these words like that. The word frequency diagram for the 100 people, hand-picked successful writers that I interviewed, the biggest word was pleasure. The enjoy was number two, so as in I enjoy writing. And then the third one, the first negative word, was frustration. So frustration is quite common across all academic writers, as far as I can tell. And I even wrote an article called Frustrated Academic Writers to try to unpack that. But that for me was actual evidence that there's a link between productivity and pleasure. The successful writers were not saying, I hate writing. They were saying, I get pleasure from writing, but they weren't saying they got pleasure because it's easy. They actually were saying they got pleasure because it's hard. The same thing that I said at the beginning. It's a challenge. It's an exciting challenge, and that's what they get pleasure from. So that was my aha moment. And I started doing research on, okay, who's written about this link between productivity and pleasure in academic writing? And the answer was practically no one. So that was why I knew I had to write this book.
Fantastic. Professor, you introduced the concept of a right space built on five dimensions: social, physical, aesthetic, creative, and emotional. Which of these do most writers neglect first and why?
Well, I think we talk a lot and we write about a lot. If you go and pull books on how to be a successful writer off the shelf, they'll address productivity, they'll address craft and style, and maybe strategic things. They mostly don't talk about emotion, so that E in space. But mostly they also don't talk about the aesthetic dimensions of writing, the physical dimensions of writing, or even the creative dimensions of academic writing, by which I mean the creative challenge of doing something that's pushing knowledge forward. So, really, out of that SPACE, social, physical, aesthetic, creative, and emotional, actually, the social we don't always talk about that much either. So, all five of those are really kind of outside the main things that books on writing tell us we should focus on, which are, sit down every day, do your writing, learn about grammar. It's a very kind of eat your vegetables approach to writing. So they're all important, but I usually suggest to people, if they're really struggling with productivity or with self-confidence or even with style, to start with the emotions. Acknowledge your emotions about writing. If they're really, really negative and the thing you want to do is run in the opposite direction from your writing desk, no productivity tips in the world are going to work for you in the long run. You need to want to be there. So it's that intrinsic pleasure in writing that I'm really trying to address with this book, but from all those different angles.
Dr. Helen, you gathered narratives of writing-related pleasure from nearly 590 faculty members and graduate students across disciplines, a truly remarkable breed of voices. With that scale of research behind you, I'm curious, what was the most surprising or counterintuitive thing you discovered about how successful writers actually feel about their craft?
So the question I asked, the research I did, was I asked these 590 writers, and this was in various countries, but again, mostly academics and mostly faculty and PhD students, and all across the disciplines, so wide range of people. And the question I asked them, the prompt I gave them 10 minutes to write, blank piece of paper, and I said, write about a time in your life when writing gave you pleasure. So I wasn't specifically asking about anything really except that, because I was interested to see, first of all, what would people choose? Would they choose something from the distant past or the writing they did this morning? Would they choose writing that they did on a computer or writing that they did by hand? Would they choose academic writing because they were all academics? Or would they choose personal writing, writing a poem, writing a letter, writing in their journal? And I honestly didn't know what they would choose. Um, and of course, you could get pleasure from many different things, but I still think that first choice, when you get asked this question, that first thing that you think, oh, yeah, I remember, is really meaningful. And what I discovered, I don't know if this is counterintuitive or perfectly obvious, but there was no one thing. Roughly half wrote about childhood, roughly half wrote about things that happened writing from their adult years, mostly from postgraduate onwards, so kind of higher level research. The biggest gap was very few people said that they enjoyed undergraduate level writing, or very few people chose an undergraduate assignment. They might choose a high school assignment, but often it was way back to when they were 5 and writing a poem for their grandmother, that kind of thing. Roughly half said that they wrote with a computer, roughly half with notebooks or whatever, in that particular situation. But actually, a fair number of people did both, and I hadn't expected that. I wasn't looking for that, and I found a lot of people who wrote about how maybe they would write something on a whiteboard and then they'd type it up and then they'd print it out and then they'd mark it with highlighters and then they'd edit it again. And that made me much more aware of the kind of hybrid processes that some people play with and experience. So, and I learned that some people find pleasure in really strange places. So you might get one person who writes, the most pleasure I ever had was when I was writing on sabbatical and I had all the time in the world, complete freedom, no deadlines. And another person will say, well, this may sound strange, but it was the time that I had to write a 3-hour exam in a foreign language about a topic I knew nothing about. And I came out of that exam knowing that I had really done it. So some people thrive on and even get pleasure from pressure. Others, the pressure is what kills the pleasure. So what I learned and really focused on in the book is that there's no one way to find pleasure in writing. Really, the key is to figure out what gives you pleasure, not just in writing, but just in life. What are your hobbies? What are the things that you enjoy most? Are you an introvert or an extrovert? Do you do physical things or do you do art with your hands? And then how can you bring those things that you love to do into your writing practice? How can you use what you've learned from your hobbies and your joys and all those other things in life? How can you bring that into your writing rather than only bringing in the hard, the academic mind and nothing else, which I think is often what we do.
Dr. Helen, we often assume that accomplished academic writers have a confident, even comfortable relationship with writing. But I wonder if your research challenge that assumption. And I would love to explore this through a personal lens as well. You use what you call a pleasure prompt in your work. Recall a time in your life when writing gave you pleasure. When you pose that simply prompt to hundreds of scholars, what did the responses reveal about the emotional and psychological life of a writer that productivity frameworks or writing guides often miss?
Hmm. Well, again, I learned a lot from reading other people's responses, but also thinking about my own. But I think one of the things that's changed for me since doing the research, which may answer your question, is I now bring a lot more um, color, a lot more tactile, kinetic processes into my academic writing than I used to. So I realized that some of the times in life that have given me the most pleasure have been when I've been sitting with a text and colored pencils, highlighting all of the ocean, the water imagery in a Shakespeare sonnet or something. In high school, I did things like that. And if you look at my writer's diet book and my online writer's diet test, where people can put a sample of their writing in and then it highlights different parts of speech in different colors, that's color coding. And I think I always thought that thinking through color was just a kind of guilty pleasure, but not very serious academically. You can see I love color, this is the universe I live in. And yet I always thought, oh, that's not the academic universe. That's my personal universe. And from doing these pleasure prompts myself and then also reading what other people wrote about, I realized that thinking through color or thinking with your hands or thinking by building things or thinking by having a conversation with another person or thinking by mind mapping, all of those are high level cognitive processes, and we shouldn't be belittling them because they're something other than black and white words on a page. So I now really encourage people to pick up, I've started making my own notebooks because I was going through so many of them. I make in my Writespace community, I distribute these little zines, which you can print out on your own printer and fold up and then track your own writing habits and your own touches on your writing. And I'm much more likely now to print something out and come in with the colored pencils rather than to think, oh, I can just do that on the screen. So those were all things that I learned from working on the book that also I learned about myself, I think, because I write, especially towards the end of the book, about my childhood growing up in a house where my mother collected artwork by this one particular pop artist, nun, from the sort of 1950s, 60s, 70s called Corita Kent. And so I grew up in this house just filled with color, making things. And of course, why did I think that shouldn't be part of my writing? And yet, for several decades, I kept the two things separate. And I haven't found, there are lots of creative writing guides that talk about bringing those sorts of processes into your writing, but there are very few academic writing guides. There are a few, but I could count them on one hand.
Dr. Helen, fear, anxiety, and self-doubt are deeply familiar to most writers. How do you suggest writers cast light on the shadows without simply pretending those emotions don't exist?
Yeah, it's difficult. I don't want to sugarcoat things and say that you can take all the hard things or all the boring things with writing and turn them around, just by being happy. So the metaphor that I use in the book is chiaroscuro, Italian for light and darkness, all in one word. And that's, of course, a whole tradition in painting, where the way you bring the light forward in the viewer's eye is by adding shadows. Very particular technique. And of course, there's a whole psychology literature from Jung and many others about the shadow side and how we can learn about, we don't need to be afraid of the shadow. We can learn from the things that we dislike or that we fear. And I think the same's true of our anxieties about writing, our frustrations around writing. They are all things that we can have conversations with. In the book, I almost literally do that. So that's one way, is simply acknowledging, making them real, and often talking to other people about them. Just today, I was mentoring a younger academic. I've been assigned, through a mentoring scheme to be the senior scholar who talks to her. And one of the first things she said to me, and she said it several times, is that she suffers from imposter syndrome. And here she is so successful by many measures in her life, and yet she's weighed down by this feeling that she's somehow not good enough. So some things we actually can address by looking at them, by paying attention to them, by bringing them into the light and talking about them. Having said that, some writing tasks are just tedious, not fun, boring. So the one that I tried to address in my own life at one point was just email, administrative email. I had a, you know, administrative leadership role in a university, and I just hated the emails. And partly because I write, because of the way I write, I can't just write a sloppy email. So, um, so I spend too long on them and want everything to be perfect. And then I think, why did I spend so long on that stupid email? So at one point, I actually made my email, my relationship with email, a kind of subject of a little mini research study. And I created a little mosaic, not unlike the cover of the book there, actually, where for every email, I made a little tile, like on a mosaic, and I made them in different colors depending on what I was researching that day. So, or that week. One week I looked at how many emails come to me from inside and how many from outside the university. Another week it was how many come from people who are above me in the hierarchy and how many below. Another was how many do I spend more than 5 minutes on or less than 5 minutes on. And then I could see from this little color-coded pathway that I made, I could see the answers and I could learn about my own practice. Did that speed up my email? Of course not. It actually made it slower. And after a month or two, I stopped doing it. But it made it more enjoyable because I brought to it all the things I write about in the book. I made it more social. I told people about it. And I also really took the time to think about who I was communicating with. So, emails come in and they all look the same. But if you just stop for a moment and try to picture the person, imagine the person at the other end. So I brought in the social pleasure of being a human being communicating with others. I brought in the physical and aesthetic pleasure of making these little tiles with my colored pencils. I brought in the creative and cognitive pleasure, the challenge of turning it into a research project, something that I could frame with my academic brain. And all of this meant that for a few months, or a short period of time at least, I got more pleasure from my email practice because I'd wrapped all these other things around it. So, what I suggest in the book, and I have explicit prompts for doing this, is that you actually bring this space rubric. You bring the social, physical, aesthetic, creative, and emotional dimensions of yourself and your work to that thing that you want to make more pleasurable and see what happens. And it may not, instantly make you love literature reviews, but it may help you find a different way into it and a lighter heart.
Professor include creative pleasure prompts throughout the book. Can you walk us through one that has had a particularly strong impact on the writers you have worked with?
I think the one that people talk to me about most is related to what I've already mentioned, which is the physicality of writing and the aesthetics of writing. A lot of people say, oh, yeah, when I read that, I was reminded that I love writing in notebooks, but I've stopped doing it because I'm always on my laptop. I was reminded that I like going for walks, and I could just be talking into my phone voice recorder while I'm on a walk and be thinking differently. So, all of the prompts around physical actions, the physical and aesthetic, which are very close together, they overlap. But I think those have had the most probably impact on changing people's practice. They actually can see something specific. And often it comes through the pleasure prompt, right? So they start out writing about when was a time in my life when I really enjoyed writing while I was sitting in the park with a notebook, mind mapping about my paper that I was writing. And then it's like, aha, maybe if that gave me pleasure then, I could try that again now. And maybe that would help bring more pleasure to this particular writing project I'm working on now.
Dr. Helen, there is often a perceived tension between rigorous academic writing and joyful expression. How do you bridge that gap for scholars who feel constrained by disciplinary conventions?
Well, it's a complicated question. I mean, first of all, joyful expression. What does that mean? Does that mean joyful on the part of the author that I'm having finding pleasure from the writing, or that it somehow is feels joyful to the reader, right? So I would separate those out for a start, although they are related. And I would say that anybody can get pleasure from doing their work well. So a well-crafted academic article that follows a template and is very much within conventions can be very pleasurable to produce when you know it's your best work and you know that other people are going to read it and get not necessarily joy from it, but they'll benefit from it. Having said that, there are many academic conventions that seem designed to squash not only human pleasure, but just being human, basically. So much writing, and this was the subject of my book, Stylish Academic Writing, that we're writing about things that we care about for other people who are going to care about them, and yet we've been trained and acculturated into making them as inhuman, dry, often quite wordy sounding as possible. And often those conventions come about through fear. We follow the conventions because we fear stepping over the line and doing something else. I think that for some people, and I'm certainly one of them, pushing against the conventions is itself a pleasurable act because it's creative, it's challenging, it's growing our craft, growing our skills, but it's also making then a clearer connection to the reader. I know that if I tell a story with examples and people in it, it will be a more engaging read for somebody than if I put it all into statistics in very complicated sentences. Even if I take those statistics and put them in a clear diagram and then explain them in clear language, that's going to bring me more pleasure to create and them more pleasure to consume. So joyful expression is not the phrase I would choose for talking about what I call stylish academic writing. I think a really important thing to remember here, and it goes back to that idea of chiaroscuro, the light and the dark, is that when I say writing with pleasure, I don't mean that you should be dancing through the daisies, going, oh, I love to write. This is so much fun. It's so easy. That's not what the people I interviewed were saying when they said that they get pleasure from writing. They were saying, writing is hard, writing is challenging. That's where I get the pleasure. So joyful expression would be more, yeah, I would push against that phrase, although I do use the word joy a lot because as well as pleasure, as well as style and stylish writing, because I think we need more language that acknowledges that academic writing doesn't have to be unpleasurable, quite the opposite.
Dr. Helen, the physical dimension of bright space suggests that writing isn't purely a mental act. How does our physical environment and bodily awareness shape the quality and pleasure of our writing?
Well, we live in bodies. We are embodied creatures. And yet, academics are kind of often trained, depends on the discipline, but we're trained to live in our heads, right? And there's a famous TED Talk by Sir Kenneth Robinson, who's no longer alive, but great educator, where he talks about academics as people who believe that the only reason they have bodies is to carry their heads to meetings. And I think there's some truth to that, that we don't want our bodies to be here getting in the way of our brilliant thoughts. But we have to use our bodies to even to type, even to talk, even to think, right? It's all embodied. And I say in the book, even Stephen Hawking had to be able to move one muscle to be able to spell out the words that went into his books. He could not be completely, you cannot create without a body. Now, we could say that generative AI is challenging some of that, but well, that's a different conversation, I think. But as long one mark of being human is that we live in bodies, and we get a lot of our pleasure, comes through our bodies. There's intellectual pleasure, but there's also the pleasure of riding your bike on a beautiful day, right? And there's no reason we should disconnect those things. Indeed, we should connect them. In my book, Air and Light and Time and Space, several of the people I interviewed, when I asked them, about times when they felt, or in the Writing with Pleasure research as well, people would say, oh yeah, there was this one time when I was going to the gym every morning and going for a swim, and then I would go to this cafe where they made this great coffee, and I would work on my PhD or whatever. And I just remember that the writing seemed to flow then. And I'm thinking, maybe there's a connection, right? You know? So in the chapter, the P chapter, the space, the physical dimension of writing, I talk about paying attention to your body when you're writing, but also before you're writing, and also when you're taking breaks from writing, right? So if you are in a fit body that's going for a swim every morning before writing, and your blood's pumping and the endorphins are going, your writing's going to be better. Your brain's going to be working better. That's fairly obvious. But also, if you're working on a laptop where you're sitting like this all the time and your neck's getting tighter and tighter and tighter, your posture, your whole way of sitting is going to make a difference. So that's the while you're writing, but then also the space where you're writing. And then this is where we start to move over into the aesthetics. I've read books by people who say, oh, you can write anywhere, and you don't need to have a wonderful study. You could write with the cat crawling up your back. That's Charles Bukowski, who wrote the poem Air and Light and Time and Space that I took my title of my book from. He said, you don't need air and light and time and space, just write the book. And, it seems to me air and light and time and space are pretty nice things to have, actually. And I do write with more pleasure and therefore more productively and more expansively when I have a window when I can look at, when I'm surrounded by objects that have meaning for me. In my case, when I have color around me. For somebody else, it might be when everything's very, very still and very zen and beige. But, different people have different things they respond to. But if you come to your writing with a body that's already, in good shape, to an environment that stimulates you, and then to an ergonomic setup that helps you, where you take breaks and all those sorts of things, all of those things are going to affect your writing. And I'm not the first person to say that by any means, but I did feel like it deserved a chapter, because so much of the literature on academic writing is all up in the head. It's all just about the ideas.
Professor, you argue that even an administrative email can be approached with delight. What's your practical advice for finding pleasure in writing we would rather skip altogether?
A practical, can you say that again? A practical,
Yeah. So, what's your practical advice for finding pleasure in writing we would rather skip altogether?
okay. I mean, I think I've kind of addressed that in various ways, but um, one thing I write about in my chapter on just emotions, around the E chapter, bringing just emotional delight, bringing a sense of delight, is something that I call happy penguins. So I invite people in the book, and when I run workshops on this, to think about something that you do just because you love doing it. So usually a hobby or a pastime, and people, they'll say, "Oh, I love cooking," or "I love." Um, Training for marathons or people have different things, but it's usually things that in fact do have some element of being social, physical, aesthetic, challenging, and they enjoy it. They do it because they intrinsically enjoy it. So then I say, okay, and what about your writing? And often for people, it's the exact opposite. So how do we bring the pleasure to the writing? Well, we find all the elements in the writing that we try to amplify whatever pleasure we already have and to find it, to identify it, to bring more of it in. So that's all in the book. But sometimes there are things that we just hate. So back to my email. Or sometimes it can be hard to find your way to any pleasure at all in writing if you've been told for the last 10 years that you're a terrible writer, or if you've been, somehow people are often sort of scarred and traumatized by criticism they've received in the past. What are you going to do to turn it around? So there's a psychologist called Barbara Fredrickson who wrote a book called Positivity. And she talks about the broaden and build cycle, where if you come to a task, it doesn't have to be writing, any task, and this is well documented in the behavioral psychology literature. You come to a task with a sense of pleasure, with enjoyment, with expectations that it's going to go well. You do the task and things go well. So you've reinforced your expectation. And the next time you come with even more of a sense of, oh, this is going to be fun and I'm going to be good at it. And so it becomes this sort of expanding upward spiral. That's the broaden and build. It broadens as you build on your experiences of positive encounters with this task. But it can go the other way. So imagine you come to write that last chapter of your dissertation and you've run out of money and your partner has just called you to say that the roof is leaking and you met with your supervisor last week and they don't like your work. And so you sit down with all these anxieties already weighing you down. The chances of you having a good writing hour are pretty small, right? Because you're coming in already with all that weight and all that lack of self-belief and certainly lack of pleasure. So at the end of the hour, what do you say? Yep, it's true. I'm worthless. I'm terrible. I hate writing. You've reinforced all the negative things. And so that becomes this downward spiral, the opposite of broaden and build. So how do you intervene? How do you go from the negatives to the positive if you just can't find anything to draw on? There's nothing about this task that you want to do. And that's where the happy penguins come in. So Barbara Fredrickson did this one little piece of research that caught my attention, which was she had um, her research subjects come into the lab, probably undergraduate students. They were put into three groups, and each one was given a video to watch for just a few minutes. And those videos were designed to put them either into a positive mood, a negative mood, or just a neutral, kind of emotionless frame of mind. And then she would give them a task to do. And one of the tasks that they were given, that one group was given, was to write about everything they could think of that they would do in the next hour after they left the psychology lab. And what she found was that the people who watched a negative video, so this would be like two people arguing or somebody about to fall off a cliff, something that makes you feel tense and anxious, they were kind of closed down by it. They didn't have a whole lot of creative ideas. They say, oh, well, from here, I'm going to go to my next class, right? Same thing for the people who watch the neutral emotions one, which would be something like watching a screensaver, right? Autumn leaves or falling sticks or something. But the third group watched a video that was designed to make them laugh. And they had some different videos they showed, but the one I liked was the idea they watched penguins jumping into the water. So it's really hard to watch a video of penguins jumping into the water and not just start laughing. They're pushing each other over, whatever. So it doesn't have to be penguins, it could be anything, but anything that makes you laugh. And if you have children, it could be, your own child laughing. They're just those things that light us up. And the people who watch the Happy Penguin videos, they're in the same psychology lab, they're given the same prompt, they write more, they have more ideas, they have more creative ideas, they get twice as many words on the page. Everything expands because they've come in with laughter. So the intervention there is, okay, if you can't think of a single positive thing about your writing, find something that will make you smile, something that will make you laugh. Watch the Happy Penguin video, look at a video of your children, write a poem if you like to do that, pick a few flowers from your garden if that's what you like to do, and put them on your desk. Anything that's just going to turn that negative mood around into a positive one, even if the positive mood has nothing to do with the writing. And then at least you have a chance that when you do sit down, you're going to go, oh, yeah, okay, I'll try this again. You have more resilience, you have just more creativity in there. And if that can happen a few times, then you're on the broaden and build cycle. You start to go up. Oh, actually, last time I sat down, I was pretty happy with what I wrote. So, it's what we might call mind games. It's the psychology of writing, which of course is the psychology of human behavior of life. And I would much rather have people come to their writing with pleasure because they love it and they're excited about it. I talk to people a lot about trying to learn to love the craft because people will often see it as a really hard and bad thing if they have to edit a sentence over and over again to get it to where they want it. And I say, well, what if that were a good thing? What if it were like bringing a sculpture out of a piece of marble, piece by piece by piece? That's not easy, but it's satisfying and pleasurable. What if that's how you think about writing sentences, about language? And so if people can come to the hard work with the pleasure in the hard work, that's going to ultimately be the strongest combination. And that's where writing with pleasure is then also going to become writing productively.
Dr. Helen, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. If every academic or professional writer internalized the lessons of writing with pleasure, how do you think it would change the culture of writing in universities and workplaces?
We'd have happier people writing more. They'd be writing things that are more pleasurable to read because we'd feel the pleasure coming through. They would feel opened up and emboldened to push against those conventions and to tell stories and use examples and not hide behind, that language that they think they have to. But I like to think as well that we would have a more generous culture towards each other. And I do write about this a little bit in Writing with Pleasure. I also write about it in Air and Light and Time and Space, about how uh, many people are quite resilient generally. People bounce back from all kinds of things. People can deal with the chiaroscuro of their own writing practice. But the thing people have the most trouble bouncing back from, in my experience and based on my interviews and research, is really harsh criticism. And academic discourse is all about harsh criticism. So I know your podcast is business talk, and it may be a slightly different range of people. I think the culture of business is a little more about building people up to be more successful in the culture. A lot of academic culture is about tearing people down, and oh, you think you're so smart. Let me rip a strip off you here. And often doing it in a really, really mean way, especially when they can hide behind blind peer review where nobody knows who they are. So they're the expert, they're delivering their opinion, and it can be as nasty as they want, and nobody stops them. The the harm that causes to writers, the amount of pleasure that it wipes off, out of the universe because people are then so anxious and so scarred, is just terrible. So I have a section in there about the pleasure of praise. Why are we so why don't we want to praise people? Somehow in academic culture, it's like, oh, that's not our job to praise them. We need to, show them how to improve. But praise is often how people improve because they feel that somebody has faith in them. It's like the flower turning to the sun. So I like to think that a culture of writing with pleasure wouldn't just be about our own pleasure. It would be about helping other people find pleasure in writing. It would be about bringing positive responses to their writing as a way of helping them grow into better writers rather than trying to destroy all the pleasure. So that's my vision of this beautiful universe. Where writing with pleasure is not easy. It's not easy. But it's pleasurable because it's a fascinating creative challenge that we're all undertaking together for each other and with each other.
Listeners, that brings us to the end of today's conversation. And what a conversation it has been. If today's discussion has inspired you to rethink your relationship with writing, we encourage you to pick up a copy of Writing with Pleasure. Dr. Helen Sword, thank you for reminding us that writing doesn't have to be a struggle. It can be a source of genuine joy, creativity, and even delight. Until next time, keep writing and keep finding pleasure in every word. Thank you so much, Dr. Helen Sword.
Thank you.